So initially, we asked people how much they actually spent through collaborative arrangements. During the OGC's work on public sector spending, they estimated that about 1.3 billion per annum of that 220 billion was actually spent on food. However, there are an awful lot of central government organisations that procure facilities management contracts, of which food, restaurant services are part of it. So we don't think that's the entirety, but it's still a pretty large amount. They further broke that down. MOD is about 580 million. The prison service, 124 million. The supply chain in the NHS, 144 million. And the then Purchasing and Supplies Agency of the NHS, another 140 million. So it's quite a wide spread, largely concentrated really in the MOD. So this graphic shows you how much of the food spend is channeled through collaborative arrangements in the organisations that we actually surveyed. 74 of the organisations that we surveyed said they didn't buy food, and I would suspect that is because they have facilities management contracts that provide them with that service. Regrettably, if you do quick maths, out of 180 organisations, not everybody was able to provide us with an estimation. There were 45 organisations that really couldn't say whether they spent through a collaborative arrangement. So then we said, OK, you're using collaborative arrangements. What's the value? What's the benefit to you? 93% of the organisations felt that they always or often got better value for money if they did something collaboratively. They also felt that generally, if they did more, they'd get even more out of it. We then asked specific questions, so how much do you get in benefit? And here you can see that some organisations felt that they could get as much as 20% reduced prices by working collaboratively with either other organisations in their locality or within their sector. Again, 49 organisations weren't able to provide us with any data. So this led us to believe, well, if you think that collaborative arrangements are good, how easy are they to access? And actually we found that there was quite a lot of concern that in the food sector in particular, people weren't very well versed in what was available, and they also didn't feel that they possibly had enough expertise in order to get the best deals in their own particular staff. It's just about 50% thought that they had insufficient information on the collaborative options that were open to them. So one of the ways round lack of expertise is to try and segment your procurement spend and work out which areas can be managed as a category and as a whole. So we asked some questions about how many organisations were able to set up themselves in that way. Unfortunately, there was quite a lot of concern amongst heads of procurement that they didn't really have enough evidence to base some of their decisions on sometimes. They often felt that they lacked good quality management information, which again, as an auditor, if I had £1 for every time someone told me that, I'd be a very rich woman and I wouldn't be doing this job. They also felt that actually they didn't always understand what the end user wanted, and I think that sort of comes back to Peter's point. If you don't have that dialogue, then you may not be procuring the right things. They also felt that their knowledge of the supply market was probably not as good in this particular area as in some of the other areas. And so if you don't understand the supply market, you're perhaps not always aware what collaborative options there are. And finally, I think always the most challenging thing in government is how do you document what the benefits are, what the costs are, and then come up with the right answer across a range of different options. So on food, we actually found that 11 central government departments, 25 local authorities and 22 health trusts used category management for their food procurement. And largely they felt that actually that had been a really successful and beneficial way to manage themselves. Just over 70% answered that it had been either very successful or fairly successful. Regrettably, there were 7% who felt that it hadn't worked for them and therefore they had moved on to other arrangements. Around 18% of the organisations that bought food didn't have any central contracts in place, which is quite an interesting thing. And of the other organisations, they felt that 90% compliance was made with purchasing through central contracts. And I think in food, that's probably quite an easy achievement. I think it's much more difficult when you've got stationery and things where people like certain types of goods and services, and if there's a way round going not through the central contract, they can sometimes find it. I suspect that food, it's a much more difficult task. So what does all this mean? Well, we tried to come up with a way to think about how standard goods and commodities could be procured in a slightly more effective way. This was very early thinking, and actually, after the election and the events that have unfurled, government has actually moved in this way totally themselves. What we felt was that there are certain categories of spend that are absolutely commodities. And it doesn't matter whether you're a hospital or a central government department. Energy is energy. It can be bought effectively by people who know the market, who can understand how to get the best deals, and then that can be channeled down through the rest of the public sector. So it's a simple and a common commodity. And the figures on this graphic are OGC provided. They do realise that they're not as great as they might be, and I'm hoping that the next round of information will give us some even more sophisticated and better quality data. At the other end of the spectrum, where you're looking at something that's very specialised and potentially very complex, which is my previous audit world, is defence military equipment. There's no one else in the UK that goes and buys nice, shiny tanks. It is completely focused on MOD, and they need to be responsible for it. In between that, you've got some other things, information technology, something that I'm working at a lot at the moment. There are some standard commodity software that could be bought by Buying Solutions or by another buying organisation on behalf of the public sector. But there are other things that you operate in your own organisations that will be slightly more bespoke, will be slightly more specialised, and therefore you might need to control that to make sure you get the best value for your business. We're not arguing for one super procurement agency that is going to dominate the world and buy for everyone. What we're asking for is for people to make sensible decisions about the size of the approach to a market and bundling up government instead of having lots of different small approaches to lots of the same suppliers. What would this mean? Well, ultimately, we feel that it's going to reduce costs. Our report basically set out our view that we need some kind of pan-government framework, which actually specifies whether procurement activity does belong with the organisation itself or whether it should be undertaken in a more coordinated and national way. If we have a national approach, that doesn't actually mean that local suppliers and small and medium-sized enterprises can't be involved. For example, you've got national wholesalers or a consortium of people who have a team of smaller providers that will satisfy a particular region, particularly on sustainability grounds, you don't want people shipping across the country when something local can be just as good.